The battle that changed everything. General Vexthor of the Korthak Empire had witnessed the fall of 1,000 worlds, but nothing had prepared him for the footage playing on his command screen. The battle recorder showed the final moments of his elite strike force against a single human vessel near the edge of their solar system. What he saw defied every law of warfare he understood. The human ship was damaged, leaking atmosphere, with half its weapons destroyed. Any rational species would have surrendered or fled. Instead, the humans did something impossible. They rammed their crippled vessel directly into the Korthak flagship, detonating their own reactor in a blaze that consumed both ships. The last transmission from the human captain was burned into Vexthor's memory. You want to know what humans are? We're the species that hugs our enemies while pulling the pin. The madness that spreads fear. Commander Zarketh stood beside his general, his scarred face pale with disbelief. 3 more incidents like this had occurred across the outer rim. Humans who fought past the point of death, who turned their own ships into weapons, who treated certain defeat as merely another tactical option. The Korthak military database now contained over 50 reports of humans doing the impossible. Die Kepler Station, a single human engineer named Tom Bradley, had held off an entire boarding party for 6 hours using nothing but maintenance tools and repair drones. When finally overwhelmed, he had triggered the station's mining charges, taking 200 Korthak warriors with him into the void. His final words, recorded by security systems, were a casual, "Sorry folks, looks like everyone's having a bad day." The pattern was always the same. Humans refused to acknowledge when they were beaten. They fought with broken bones, damaged ships, and impossible odds, as if defeat was simply not a concept they understood. Worse, they seemed to find the situation amusing. The strategy that defies logic. What terrified the Korthak most was not human weapons or technology, but their complete disregard for military logic. During the Proxima engagement, a human fleet had deliberately split their forces in the face of superior numbers, something no trained commander would ever do. Yet somehow this mistake had allowed them to strike at 3 separate Korthak supply lines simultaneously, crippling an entire sector's offensive capability. The human commander, Captain Jake Morrison, had transmitted a message after the victory. "Sorry about the confusion, but we figured you guys might be getting bored with predictable tactics. Hope this keeps things interesting." Interesting. The humans thought galactic warfare was interesting. Intelligence reports revealed even more disturbing truths. Humans had no warrior caste, no bred soldiers, no genetic modifications for combat. They were shopkeepers, teachers, farmers, and mechanics who picked up weapons when needed and somehow became the galaxy's most unpredictable fighters. They treated war like a puzzle to be solved, rather than a ritual to be honored. The fear that cannot be named, Vexthor had built his reputation on understanding his enemies. The crystalline Vorthon fought with mathematical precision. The insectoid Zephyrians used overwhelming numbers. The energy beings of Andromeda relied on technological superiority. Every species had patterns, weaknesses, predictable responses. Humans had none of these things. They were chaos given form, impossibility made manifest. They fought with tools, not designed for war, strategies that violated basic military doctrine, and an attitude that suggested they were enjoying themselves. Most frightening of all, they seemed to get more dangerous when things got worse. The general's claws scraped against his command console as he reviewed the final report. A human survey ship had been cornered by 12 Korthak interceptors. Instead of surrendering, the humans had broadcast their location to every ship in the sector, then engaged all 12 vessels simultaneously while maintaining a running commentary about the battle. They had been destroyed, but not before taking 8 Korthak ships with them and providing tactical data to human reinforcements. The realization that shook an empire. As Vexthor stared at the tactical displays showing human expansion across the outer rim, he understood why his warriors whispered in fear. It was not human strength they feared, or human technology, or human numbers. They feared human unpredictability, the absolute refusal to behave like prey when cornered. Every Korthak warrior knew they might die in battle. That was acceptable, even honorable. But humans had introduced something new to galactic warfare: the certainty that victory against them would cost more than defeat. They had weaponized their own mortality, turned their weakness into strength, and made their enemies afraid not of losing but of winning. The humans were teaching the galaxy a terrifying lesson. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who has already decided they have nothing left to lose. The ultimatum that backfired. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, watching as 12 massive Korthak warships materialized from hyperspace around his single diplomatic vessel. The alien ships were impressive, each one 10 times larger than his own, bristling with enough firepower to glass a planet. Any sane species would have immediately transmitted surrender codes and begged for mercy. Instead, Morrison turned to his communications officer and said, "Lisa, open a channel. Let's see what our new friends want to chat about." The main screen flickered to life, revealing General Vexthor in all his terrifying glory. 9 feet of armored nightmare, scarred from countless battles, with eyes that burned like dying stars. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3,000 years of conquest. "Humans of Earth," Vexthor growled. "I am General Vexthor, of the Korthak Empire. Your species has been found guilty of interfering with our rightful expansion. You will surrender your homeworld immediately, or we will take it by force. You have 1 of your hours to comply." The response that shocked a galaxy. Morrison scratched his chin thoughtfully, as if considering a dinner invitation rather than a death sentence. His crew watched with quiet amusement as their captain leaned back in his chair and grinned at the alien general. "Well, General, that's quite an offer," Morrison replied cheerfully. "But here's the thing about us humans. We have this weird habit of saying no to bullies. So how about this counteroffer? You turn those fancy ships around and head home, and we'll pretend this whole misunderstanding never happened." The silence that followed was deafening. Across 12 Korthak bridges, thousands of alien warriors stared in disbelief. No species had ever responded to Korthak ultimatums with casual dismissal and humor. Vexthor's claws extended involuntarily as rage coursed through his massive frame. "You dare mock the Korthak Empire?" he roared. "We have conquered 47 star systems. We are death incarnate." Morrison nodded politely. "That's nice. We invented democracy, pizza, and rock music. Want to compare accomplishments all day? Or should we get to the part where you realize you've made a terrible mistake? The battle that defied physics. What happened next would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for centuries. The Defiance was outnumbered 12 to 1, outgunned by a factor of hundreds, and trapped in the center of a perfect tactical formation. By every law of warfare, the engagement should have lasted less than 30 seconds. Instead, Morrison's ship began to move in patterns that violated basic physics. It spun, rolled, and twisted through space like a dancer, somehow avoiding targeting locks that should have been impossible to break. The Korthak ships, designed for overwhelming firepower against stationary targets, found themselves firing at empty space while the human vessels seemed to anticipate their every move. "How is this possible?" Vexthor demanded of his tactical officer. "Their ship has inferior engines." The answer came from Morrison himself over an open channel. "General, you're thinking like a Korthak. Big, slow, predictable. We're thinking like humans. Small, fast, and absolutely nuts." The Defiance wasn't just dodging, it was improvising. Morrison's crew had rerouted power systems in ways the ship's designers never intended, turning life, support energy into shield strength, and navigation power into weapons capacity. They were literally rewriting their ship's capabilities in real time while under fire. The moment fear became reality. The turning point came when the Defiance did something no military mind could have predicted. Instead of trying to escape the trap, it flew directly toward the largest Korthak vessel, all weapons blazing. The alien ship's captain, confident in his armor and shields, didn't even bother to change course. That was his mistake. The human ship fired everything it had at a single point on the Korthak hull, then fired again at the exact same spot, then again. The aliens had prepared for distributed damage, for logical targeting of multiple systems. They had not prepared for the human concept of overkill focused on one tiny area until something breaks. The massive alien warship's shields collapsed in that single section, and the Defiance punched through like a bullet through paper. In the few seconds it took the Korthak crew to react, Morrison's ship had damaged critical systems throughout their vessel. The withdrawal that started a legend. As alarms blared across the Korthak flagship and 3 other vessels reported similar precision damage, General Vexthor faced a choice he had never encountered before. He could continue the battle and likely destroy the human ship, but at the cost of several of his own vessels and thousands of his warriors, or he could withdraw and preserve his fleet for more important battles. For the first time in Korthak military history, a general chose tactical withdrawal over glorious victory. Morrison's voice followed them as they retreated. "Thanks for stopping." "Bye, General. Next time maybe try calling ahead. We humans are much friendlier when we're expecting company." The message that spread through space. Within hours, the story of the Defiance had spread across the galaxy through trade routes, communication networks, and whispered conversations in every spaceport cantina. A single human ship had faced 12 Korthak warships and not only survived but forced their retreat. The implications terrified every military commander in known space. If humans could do this with one diplomatic vessel against overwhelming odds, what could they do with an actual fleet? What could they do when they were angry instead of just politely annoyed? As Captain Morrison set course for Earth to report the encounter, he had no idea that his casual defiance had just marked humanity as the galaxy's new apex predator. The Korthak Empire, which had ruled through fear for millennia, had just learned what it felt like to be afraid. The age of human expansion was about to begin, and the galaxy would never be the same. The engineer who changed everything. Deep in the research labs of Luna Station, Dr. Zoe Fletcher was having the time of her life. While the galaxy's most feared empire mobilized against humanity, she was solving puzzles that had never been asked before. Her latest creation sat humming quietly on the lab bench, a device no bigger than a coffee cup that would make the Korthak's worst nightmares come true. Fletcher had spent her career studying alien technology, not to copy it, but to understand why it worked the way it did. The Korthak built weapons for overwhelming force. The crystalline Confederacy designed systems for mathematical precision. Every alien race followed logical patterns that made sense to their particular way of thinking. Humans, Fletcher realized, didn't think like anyone else. So she built technology that didn't work like anyone else's either. Her adaptive combat system could analyze any enemy weapon in real time and develop countermeasures within minutes. More importantly, it could predict what the enemy would do next based on their established patterns, then do something completely different in response. It was organized chaos, military jazz improvisation, warfare that changed its own rules mid-battle. Third test that terrified observers. When Fletcher's system was installed on the patrol ship Rebel's Dream, commanded by Captain Marcus Kane, the results exceeded every expectation. The ship's first encounter with a Korthak scouting force became the stuff of legend. The alien vessels approached using their standard intimidation formation, weapons charged, expecting the usual response of fear and surrender. Instead, the Rebel's Dream began broadcasting human music at full volume while performing what could only be described as a space ballet around the enemy ships. "Unknown vessel," the Korthak commander transmitted. "Cease your erratic behavior and prepare to be boarded." Kane's response, delivered while his ship executed a perfect barrel roll between 2 enemy vessels, was typical human. "Sorry, can't hear you over the music. Also, you might want to check your rear sensors." The Korthak commander looked at his tactical display and felt his blood freeze. Somehow, during their graceful dance, the human ship had deployed dozens of small devices that were now attached to his fleet's hulls. They weren't weapons or explosives, but something far worse from a military perspective. They were sensors and transmitters, turning his own ships into beacons that broadcast their positions, shield frequencies, and weapon signatures to every human vessel in the sector. The strategy that broke minds. What followed challenged every principle of galactic warfare. The Rebel's Dream didn't try to destroy the Korthak ships. Instead, it began systematically disabling them in the most embarrassing ways possible. Weapons systems shut down due to software conflicts. Navigation computers began displaying human poetry instead of star charts. Life support systems started playing children's lullabies. The Korthak warriors, trained for glorious battle and honorable death, found themselves dealing with ships that wouldn't work properly, and an enemy that treated their advanced military technology like a practical joke. When they tried to self-destruct rather than face capture, even those systems had been compromised to display "Have a nice day" messages instead of detonation countdowns. Captain Kane's voice came over their communications. "Folks, we've temporarily borrowed your ship's computer systems. Don't worry, we'll give them back once you head home. Consider this a friendly reminder that humans have been dealing with computer problems a lot longer than you have, the reputation that spread fear." Word of the rebels' dreams encounter spread through the Korthak fleet like a virus. Their most advanced warships, the pinnacle of military engineering, had been turned into floating comedy shows by a single human vessel. Worse, the humans had then helped the disabled Korthak ships repair their navigation systems and sent them home with full fuel tanks and personal messages of friendship. This act of mercy was more terrifying than any weapon. Military cultures across the galaxy understood conquest, destruction, and death. They had no framework for understanding an enemy that defeated you completely, then sent you home with a packed lunch and directions to the nearest space station. General Vexthor received the reports with growing horror. His warriors were not just losing, they were being psychologically dismantled by an enemy that refused to hate them. The humans fought like they were playing a game, with creativity and humor that made traditional military responses seem foolish and primitive. The innovation that never stopped Dr. Fletcher's adaptive systems were just the beginning. Human engineers across Earth's colonies began developing technology that violated every alien assumption about how warfare should work. Ships that could change their configurations mid-battle. Weapons that learned from each engagement and became more effective against specific enemies. Communication systems that could hack into alien networks not to steal information, but to leave helpful software updates and friendly messages. The humans were industrializing innovation, turning the very concept of war into a collaborative creative process. Each battle generated new ideas, new solutions, new ways to turn disadvantages into tactical advantages. They shared these innovations freely among their own forces, creating a military that evolved faster than any enemy could adapt to it. The fear that consumed an empire. In the command centers of the Korthak Empire, generals who had conquered star systems found themselves staring at tactical displays they no longer understood. Human ships moved in formations that shouldn't work but did. Human weapons fired in patterns that violated targeting doctrine but achieved perfect results. Human commanders made decisions that seemed insane until they proved to be brilliant. The terrifying truth was becoming clear. Humans didn't just fight differently. They thought differently. They treated war as a creative challenge rather than a sacred ritual. They solved problems that didn't exist and created solutions that shouldn't work. They had weaponized imagination itself. As reports continued to pour in from across the front lines, one thing became undeniably clear. The Korthak Empire wasn't just fighting a new enemy, they were fighting a new kind of enemy. Humans had taken the most serious business in the galaxy and turned it into an art form. The galaxy's most feared warriors were learning to fear creatures who treated galactic warfare like an engineering problem that needed a creative solution. The mission that changed history. Lieutenant Marcus Kane had never expected to become famous for breaking into a Korthak prison. But life had a way of surprising humans in the best possible ways. His stealth ship Silent Thunder drifted through the asteroid field surrounding Detention Station Omega-7, where the aliens held their most valuable prisoners. Intelligence reports indicated that captured human diplomats were being held there, but Kane had discovered something that made his blood boil with righteous anger. The Korthak weren't just holding humans. They had imprisoned representatives from dozens of species, including their own soldiers who had shown weakness by questioning orders. The station was a monument to everything wrong with the Korthak way of thinking, and Kane decided it was time for a very human solution to an alien problem. "Commander," his pilot whispered, "sensors show over 300 prisoners in that facility. We can extract maybe 20 in a stealth operation." Kane studied the tactical display and smiled the kind of smile that had been making aliens nervous for months. Rodriguez, you're thinking like a Korthak again. Limited objectives, acceptable losses, logical parameters. We're going to get them all. The plan that shouldn't work. What Kane proposed violated every principle of military rescue operations. Instead of extracting a few high-value targets quietly, he planned to disable the entire station, free every prisoner, and turn the facility into a refugee processing center. His crew of 12 would somehow overcome a garrison of 800 Korthak guards, while simultaneously managing the evacuation of hundreds of traumatized prisoners from multiple species. The plan required perfect timing, impossible coordination, and more luck than any rational being should expect. In other words, it was exactly the kind of plan that humans specialized in making work. Kane's team began by doing something the Korthak had never encountered. They asked for help. Using captured communication frequencies, they contacted prisoners inside the station and explained what they needed. Instead of treating the captives as helpless victims waiting for rescue, the humans treated them as partners in their own liberation. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Korthak prisoners who had been labeled defective began sabotaging their own guards' equipment. Captured engineers from the Zephyrian Collective started causing accidental power fluctuations. Even the station's medical staff, mostly non-violent species forced into service, began preparing for mass casualty treatment by creating delays and confusion in the security systems. The rescue that became a revolution, when Kane's team finally moved, they didn't sneak into the station like traditional commandos. They announced their arrival with a broadcast that went out on every frequency the facility could receive. Attention, everyone inside Detention Station Omega-7. This is Lieutenant Marcus Kane of the Human Defense Force. We're here to take you home. All of you. The Korthak Garrison Commander, General Mordak, activated his emergency protocols and prepared for a siege. His station was impregnable, his warriors were elite, and he had hostages to ensure compliance. What he didn't expect was for the hostages to start fighting back alongside their rescuers. The battle for Omega-7 became something unprecedented in galactic military history, a prison break that turned into a multi-species uprising. Human tactics combined with Zephyrian technical expertise, Korthak military knowledge, and the desperate creativity of beings who had nothing left to lose. The station's own defenses were turned against the guards as prisoners who knew every corridor and security system guided the human soldiers through impossible infiltration routes. The moment everything changed. The turning point came when Kane's team reached the station's medical bay and discovered something that shattered every assumption about Korthak cruelty. The wounded guards weren't being left to die. They were being treated by the same medical staff they had been oppressing for years. Injured prisoners worked alongside former captors to save lives, regardless of species or allegiance. Kane found General Mordak himself in the medical bay, wounded but alive, being treated by a human doctor who had been imprisoned for refusing to develop biological weapons. The Korthak general stared at Kane with confusion and rage. "Why?" Mordak demanded, through his pain. "Why do you save those who would destroy you?" Kane knelt beside the alien warrior and spoke with the kind of gentle honesty that had been terrifying Korthak military commanders for months. "Because that's what humans do, General. We save people. Even people who don't like us very much." The broadcast that shook the galaxy. As the last prisoners were evacuated and the station was converted into a humanitarian aid center, Kane made a decision that would echo across the stars. Instead of destroying Omega-7 or claiming it as a military prize, he opened it to refugees from across the galaxy. Any being fleeing oppression, regardless of species or political allegiance, would find sanctuary there. The broadcast went out on every communication channel in the sector. "This is Lieutenant Marcus Kane speaking from Liberation Station Omega-7. To anyone listening who needs help, who's running from something bigger than themselves, or who just wants a place where different species can work together instead of fighting each other, you're welcome here. We'll figure out the details as we go." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within days, ships began arriving from across the galaxy. Not just refugees, but volunteers, aid workers, and even former Korthak soldiers who had grown tired of endless conquest. The station became a symbol of something the galaxy had never seen before: cooperation between species based on shared values rather than shared enemies. The fear that conquered fear itself. General Vexthor received the reports from Omega-7 with the kind of existential terror that comes from realizing your entire worldview is wrong. The humans hadn't just defeated a Korthak facility. They had transformed it into something that challenged the very foundation of imperial rule. They had shown that strength could come from helping others instead of dominating them. Worse, they had proven that Korthak soldiers, when given the choice, would sometimes choose cooperation over conquest. The Empire's greatest fear wasn't human weapons or human tactics. It was human ideas spreading to their own people. As reports continued to arrive showing former enemies working together at Liberation Station, Vexthor understood that the war had entered a new phase. The humans weren't just fighting the Korthak Empire, they were offering an alternative to it. They had weaponized hope itself, and hope was the one force that no military could defend against. The galaxy was learning that the most dangerous thing about humans wasn't their ability to fight, but their refusal to stop believing that fighting wasn't the only solution. The commander who chose, Peace Commander Lisa Torres, stood in the ruins of what had once been the Korthak Empire's most important military academy on the planet Veltar. Around her, representatives from 17 different species sat in a circle that would have been impossible to imagine just months before. Former enemies shared meals, former prisoners worked alongside former guards, and the galaxy's most feared warriors were learning to fear something entirely new: the possibility of lasting peace. Torres had never wanted to be a diplomat. She had trained as a combat engineer, specializing in breaking things that needed to be broken. But the war had taught humanity something important about themselves. They were better at building than destroying, even when destruction seemed like the easier option, especially then. The negotiations had been going on for 3 days, and every species present was exhausted by the sheer complexity of trying to rebuild a galaxy that had been organized around conquest for 3,000 years. The Korthak Empire was fragmenting as species after species declared independence, but independence meant nothing if they immediately started fighting each other instead. The solution: that nobody expected. Torres looked around the circle at faces that represented billions of beings across hundreds of worlds. Crystalline delegates whose thoughts moved at light speed. Insectoid representatives whose hive minds could process thousands of conversations simultaneously. Energy beings who existed partially outside normal space-time, and dozens of others. Each species had evolved different ways of thinking, different values, different approaches to survival. Any rational military commander would have seen the situation as impossible. How do you create unity among beings who couldn't even agree on basic concepts like time, mortality, or individual consciousness? Torres smiled and did what humans did best. She threw out the rulebook and started improvising. "Okay, everyone," she said, standing up and walking to the center of the circle. "We've been at this for days trying to figure out how to make everyone happy with one big agreement. That's not going to work, because you're all too different. So let's try something else." She pulled out a simple piece of paper and began writing. "Instead of one treaty that covers everything, we're going to make a bunch of small agreements that cover specific things. Trade routes, research sharing, mutual defense, cultural exchange, whatever each pair or group of species wants to work on together." The network that changed everything. What Torres proposed violated every principle of galactic diplomacy. Instead of a hierarchical empire or a unified federation, she was suggesting a network of voluntary partnerships. Species could cooperate on issues where they agreed and ignore each other, on issues where they didn't. The only universal requirement was that disputes be resolved through negotiation rather than violence. The crystalline delegate, whose mathematical mind calculated probabilities in nanoseconds, spoke first. "This approach has a 73.7% chance of creating unstable power dynamics and regional conflicts." Torres nodded cheerfully. "Probably, but it also has a 100% chance of being better than the current system where everyone fights everyone else all the time." Perfect is the enemy of good enough, and good enough is all we need to get started. The energy being representative flickered, with what might have been amusement. Your species continues to propose solutions that should not work but somehow do. This consistency is becoming predictable. That's the nicest thing anyone said about humans all week, Torres replied. Let's see if we can make it work. The legacy that outlived fear. Years later, as Commander Torres stood in the observation deck of Harmony Station, the network's new headquarters built in the former heart of the Korthak Empire, she watched ships from hundreds of species coming and going in peaceful commerce. Children from dozens of worlds played together in the station's parks, learning from each other in ways their parents never could have imagined. A young Korthak cadet approached her, his traditional armor modified, with peaceful symbols rather than weapons of war. "Commander Torres," he said with the kind of respect once reserved for conquerors, "my instructor wants to know, how did your species know that this would work?" Torres smiled and gave him the most honest answer she could. "We didn't. We just knew that what we had before wasn't working, so we tried something different. That's what humans do. We try things." The truth that conquered an empire. As news of the Galactic Cooperation Network spread to the furthest reaches of space, the question that had started everything finally had its answer. Why did battle-hardened aliens fear humans? Not because humans were stronger or more advanced or more ruthless than other species. They feared humans because humans refused to accept that things had to stay the way they were. They looked at problems that had existed for millennia and said, let's try something different. They took systems built on fear and transformed them into systems built on hope. They turned enemies into allies, conflicts into collaborations, and conquest into cooperation. Most terrifying of all, they made it look easy. The galaxy had learned that the most dangerous force in the universe wasn't hatred or greed, or the desire for power. It was the simple human belief that everything could be better if people just tried a little harder to understand each other. And that belief, once it took root, was absolutely unstoppable.